Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. This is Chuck Bartok from beautiful Northern California on the banks of the Sacramento River. I have the privilege today of introducing you to an old friend of mine. I met him in 1970 as he left the Marine Corps. Very impressed with the young man's attitude and demeanor. We joined forces on the spot and built a wonderful team. Jim Strauss was one of the finest agents I ever worked with. He has a story to tell, and as many of you know, his book, 30 Days Has September, the first 10 days, has been on the market for a couple of weeks. Tremendous response on his website, jamesstrauss.com, and I asked Jim to join me today to tell us why it has taken 47 years for him to finally tell his story and share his experiences. 30 Days Has September in Vietnam. Thank you very much, Jim, and take it away.
Hello, Chuck. It's a pleasure to be here, of course, and thank you for taking the time to have me.
I really think the audience, and I know that your experience has affected you throughout your life. We don't. You may want to get into details. You may not want to. But I would like you to share with the people that will be watching this video why you felt compelled, even back in 1970, to do the manuscript. And then I'd like you to the words of your book are just too much to read. I mean, to digest, because you got to read it over and over again. If you want to share your experiences and outline of the book, go ahead. It's your gig, Jim. I'm just here to ask a question or two.
Well, I think it all started with training. Of course, I was a rather normal college kid, I like to think, and graduated and went to OCS and artillery school with the basic school in between, the Marine Corps training. I found Marine Corps training and Army training to be some of the most exceptional training in my life. It was fair, tough, and vital and needed. I took that to Vietnam only to have that steel door open up, slam down, and that sergeant stand there and say, "Welcome to the Nam." And my life changed forever. It was dramatic, and the drama just continued to build while I was there. I was the second lieutenant. I ended up being a company commander as a second lieutenant, which you're supposed to have 5, 6, sometimes 7 officers running a company, especially in combat. And I was it. I had a gunnery sergeant and some other non-coms running the platoons, and then we had at it. My first night I arrived was in combat, and that pretty much stayed for the rest of my tour in Vietnam. I was wounded and flown home back into Travis Air Force Base. I had changed so much in 30 days. And then in the hospital in Japan, I spent another several months. And when I did end up at Travis, my wife walked down the hall with all the other patients laying on gurneys that had come in on this Starlifter and could not recognize me. I had my facial features, everything about me had totally changed. And I had to talk to her in order to convince her that I was the same guy who left. But of course, I wasn't the same guy who left. I was a different person, and that person then had to come back and attempt, after the trauma of combat and being wounded, to deal with a phenomenal world that I thought bore little or no resemblance to the one I left. Only over the years did I come to discover that that phenomenal world in the United States was exactly the same world I'd left. But I had changed so much that I could no longer recognize it for what it was. I sought to deaden my nights and difficult times. I think I heard one expression at the VA once, and then saw it repeated in a comment someone made on my book, where where a veteran was asked at the VA, when was he in Vietnam? And he said, last night, because nights are usually the toughest thing for us. You with post-traumatic stress, which is what you end up with, the diagnosed DSM-4 problems are all attributed to this post-traumatic stress situation, which I've been to the VA and I've been to counselors, several now, and profited by the help that they gave me, but always tried to convince them that post-traumatic stress has much less to deal with seeing violent circumstance, participating in it, and then trying to forget it. In fact, it's the other way around. What you're doing when you go into combat is you're leaving the phenomenal world and you're entering reality. And reality much more like Goldman's Lord of the Flies than anything like you might resemble in your ordered phenomenal world back in the USA. You stay in that reality as long as you're in combat, and then bang, you're back out. And then everything is by the rules, training. I mean, I don't think I got called sir in my company more than a few times. I was junior. They gave me that nickname because my first two initials are JR, and because I was slight of build and rather short. And that's what I was. And then I fought for respect, but actually I fought to stay alive. I had no idea in training that the one definition, this guy stopped us on a long hike, and he said he wasn't our regular DI or any of that. He had been a visiting officer taking us on a 20-mile run. And in the middle, he stopped, usually for what they called a smoke break, but usually it was to let us survive for a few minutes before we continued the run. 20 miles is no short distance when you're wearing a helmet, an M14, and a full pack. What he said bit into me more in Vietnam than it ever did when he said it. And what he said was, leadership is getting other people to do what you want them to do because they want to do it. And when you've got kids with M16s and the sun goes down and there's not going to be an inquest, there's not going to be an autopsy, you're going to go out in a body bag with a Purple Heart, then you have to get people to do what you want them to do because they want to do it. When I got home out of the hospital, which took almost a year of various surgeries and different care centers, of what happened. I had only been able to keep a couple of my muddy old diaries. I always wrote when I was a kid, and I did in Vietnam. And then I wrote every day a letter home to my wife and a letter home to my parents. And I fought to get those letters to the resupply choppers so that I could at least have some attachment to home. Everything in combat is home. That's why you're there. That's what you're fighting for. You're fighting to stay alive and get back home. And then if everyone else survives along with you, great. If they don't, fine. Mr. Sullenberger, when he flew that plane into the river, was saving one life, and it was his own. And everybody else was along for the ride. If they didn't make it, fine. He made it. I made it through, and I got through. And so I wanted to lay down the reality, the difference between that reality and that phenomenal world that I experienced in training and the mythology and the John Wayne movies. I love war movies. I still go and see movies like Platoon and Full Metal Jacket, the really good ones, that touch on some of it, but none of them can really get involved because, well, some of the things in war stories, the reason the veterans can't talk about them is because they'll lose credibility. You won't believe them. It's so far-fetched that you won't believe them, and then they'll be hurt because no one will talk to them. No one will believe them. The second thing is most war stories are shameful. They are not heroic. When that patrol you see and you open up on because you think it's an enemy patrol that ends up being not an enemy patrol, well, what do you do with those bodies and those bags and the story that you're not just going to tell back home, but that you're going to tell yourself? How do you avoid waking up in the middle of the night without those people with you. And you don't. You have to accommodate them. I have all of them, and I accommodate them. I live with them. It's part of what they define as post-traumatic stress. To me, it's the change in creature that I had to become to survive again in this world. So I assembled the letters. My wife had saved every letter, and the Postal Service had done a wonderful job of getting everything back, whether I put a stamp on it because I was a collector and originally I had wanted the cancellation for my collection. That didn't prove out. Stamps didn't do real well in the wet environment. And then everything was free supposedly. So I took advantage of that, and my parents saved theirs letters. So when I was home, I had this whole collection of the diaries, the letters, some old maps. And I sat down and I started to write. I wrote about what had happened from the time that armored personnel carrier had slammed open and I stepped out into the mud of Vietnam. And those incidents, of course, are all detailed in the books. The first 10 days, yes, there was that much action. I saw action every day for 30 days and 30 nights and came to not understand what the word sleep meant anymore. My cat, Harvey, mostly I look at him and I see him sort of balancing between wakefulness and sleep, never really sleeping. And I liken the experience post-combat to that, where you're ever on edge, you're ever ready, your eyes are maybe 90% closed, but you're there and ready to go. And when you're not, you're back in a system where you're supposed to sleep for 8 hours a night, but I only need about 4 or 5, and I'm supposed to be on patrol. and so I roam the house, and you go into seismic security. If you probably don't know what that is, well, you haven't visited my home. You've got the video, the wonderful new technology. And the funny thing is, I never catch anybody. There's nobody there. They're only living in my imagination or in my need to have the flank security out. It was so hard in the jungle to have your security out all the time, and you never knew from what direction trouble was going to come. And then you would regret that you hadn't had security out in that area. And so you come back here and, man, I can now have and afford the security and then there's, of course, there's no enemy, nor is there an expectation of an enemy, and you have to fight that. Because with the habit patterns of combat veterans, over time, if you're prepared for an enemy all the time, then you become disappointed that you don't have an enemy coming in. It's like a survivalist. The survivalist has a cave and all this stuff in it. And after a while, he has to hope the apocalyptic end comes so that he can prove that he's right about, the fact that everything was falling apart. Probably isn't, regardless of your political orientation, we'll move on. And so that for me was part of the battle. I went through my drugs and my alcohol, although we should never say went using the past tense. I'm still living it, even though I'm clean and sober so many years. You don't know. And so, you also can use that. I don't look at drugs and alcohol as a terrible enemy. They kind of helped me segue through. There was no counseling. The first time I went to the VA, I went and told them my troubles, and they gave me an appointment for 6 months later. I wasn't going to be alive 6 months later. So I had to find some private help, which did help me get through. The biggest thing that got me through was family, and a family that was willing to see it through, because I was a character. Junior was coming out, and Junior needed to be stuffed back in. Killing in Vietnam, inside your unit or out, is a solution that's immediate. It's effective, it works, and there's very little follow-up to it. Over here, you're back in the phenomenal world. It does not work whatsoever. And so you have to completely change your orientation to not being exposed to those situations where you can go back and depend on Junior again. So avoid bars, avoid aggressive people, avoid road rage. That other person, they have no idea of you or what you are and could be and do. They're regular citizens, and I admire them, and I don't want them to be like me. I don't want them staying up night. I don't want them with those memories. I'm proud to have done what I did, and I'm proud to think that I might have helped in some way. And now I'm proud to think that I can help by writing these experiences to get the real deal guys to pass off the book to people who don't understand. And that way they don't have to tell them their story. They can hand my book to them and say, you want to know what it was really like? Here, read this. And then the people can come back to them and say, this has got to be total bullshit. And then the guy, the combat veteran, can say, oh yeah, that part's bullshit, because he doesn't want to necessarily ascribe that to himself, because people don't understand war stories. They don't want to understand that you truly have that capability. It's like the difference where people think of people being shot in the news and people being shot in the movies. I mean, in the movies, man, it's a great solution. And everybody's got a gun and everybody's shooting everybody else. And I always love the fact that pistols and automatics seem to be better than machine guns. Well, it isn't so, okay? A machine gun any old day will put to shame every other weapon on the combat field except supporting fires. But that was what got me through Vietnam, really, was a great memory and Fort Sill, and really taking to artillery, because artillery is an art. It's sort of like cooking. It's an art and a science all combined together. And if you have a true feel for it, like an artist, you can change the battlefield around you with those terrible but wonderful weapons, instruments. Air is not as controllable, but artillery, very accurate. And if you could apply it, which I did, and it was the key to my survival with the company, because the company didn't really want me. And I had to make myself wanted. And I used artillery. I was really good at map reading. And I was willing to do about any job to demonstrate that I was good for it to them. And they, in fact, we were a very lethal Marine rifle company. Just because we had all these problems inside, we had a race war going on inside the company. We had guys who wouldn't perform and fall asleep on duty and steal the morphine. We had this going on left and right. But when it came to dealing with the enemy, man, did it work? And did they do their jobs? And I was very proud to help shape that company in the time that I was there, and as they shaped me. It was a vitally interesting time. And then the time after I finished writing about the Vietnam story, I want to write one more book about what it was like to come home, what it was like to, the hospital in Oakland. They didn't treat me that well. All my medical service had been wonderful up till then. And then they found out I was Junior, and that didn't go down well. And they were protesting, and that was a tough one to get through. But different things, when I came home, I ended up amazingly getting a job working for the Nixon estate on the Western White House in San Clemente, because Camp Pendleton's where I got out. And ridiculously, I had kept my mouth shut when they came to investigate my battalion commander while I was in the hospital. They thought that I was protecting my battalion commander, who was a terrible drunk and a lousy commander. But I just basically couldn't talk. I was in shell shock. I could not respond about anything that had happened. I just laid there, and they thought, oh, he's covering him. So was that a bad thing? No, to the powers that be later on in my file in Camp Pendleton, when they need somebody to interface with the Secret Service and the president and all that, they picked me because I could keep my mouth shut. Well, that was extraordinary that would happen, and then I was attached to the regular police department when Nixon wasn't in town. And that was another vitally interesting time, but also it played into being a Vietnam veteran in those days, which was tough. You grew your hair as fast as you could. You got out of military uniform as quickly as possible. And then you didn't necessarily deny what you had done, but you tried to live without it having a presence. I took it off my resume because employers thought you might go postal. So I couldn't use what I considered the jewel of my entire experience on the planet. I couldn't use that to my benefit. I had to ignore that. But anyway, I'm wandering on, Chuck. I'm sure you've got a couple things you might want to ask.
What kind of a time frame do you see, Jim, in the completion of this? And I don't care what people think. It's a monumental project, for crying out loud. People talk about writers today, most of whom aren't ghostwriters. Most of them follow a pattern. There is no pattern to this book at all. How can there be a pattern to something that happened? Jim, what kind of a time frame can the public expect?
Well, I think that, I write on my website for free every chapter as I finish it. And I'm on chapter 14 right now. And I'm about halfway through that. I call them segments, not chapters, because I don't know how long they're going to be. They're usually 8 to 10 pages, maybe a few more, a few less, because they're sequenced in that part of that day that I can reconstruct. So I think the second 10 days will probably be done and on Amazon by August 1st at the very latest.
Wow.
And then I think probably November or December for the third in the series, which will take us right up to the end.
As you said, that will always be available to the public to read. So anyone can go to your website, read chapter by chapter, or if they prefer to have a book, and I understand there's also plans to make this into an audio. That's going to be a monumental chore by itself. So they can buy a book, they can buy a Kindle, they can look, Barnes & Noble, all of the ebook. I understand you're out there in all of the ebook areas. The link up here, 30 Days Has September, is showing on Amazon. But if anybody does need to go to Barnes & Noble, a neighbor of mine bought it through Barnes & Noble. And I have to compliment you because there's very few authors who would allow people to read their product for free. And so I know in my heart, because of our personal relationship, that you're writing this because you want the story to be told. And I applaud.
That's some of it, Chuck. I didn't direct the writing of this and have not toward the general public. I don't think the general public is ready for this. Like Jack Nicholson said, they're not ready for the truth, and they probably don't want to hear it. And that's fine. I directed this toward the veterans, particularly the guys who went and did this shit, and lived that life out there and then have to come back in denial and making believe that, the apocalypse now has any reality at all to it. It didn't, by the way, but that's okay. I mean, the opening scene did, where the guy's alcohol-driven, laying in his bed and puking. That had reality to it, and then the rest of it was crap. But I wanted to reach the veterans, and then I made the decision that a lot of veterans don't have enough money to buy the damn book. A lot of them are in distress. So if they could get to the library and get online, then they can read it for free. And so from start to finish, it'll be there for free. That's part of the deal. If they want to buy the book, some people like to touch and feel it. Other people like the homogeneity of the contiguous nature. Also, it's better edited, although editing is really tough when you're when you're a small team putting it out, to get it just totally pure like the big producers do. But no big publishing firm is going to pick up this book. It's not the mythology. It's not the support. I mean, you make a war movie. How do you make a war movie? Well, you borrow an aircraft carrier. Well, who from? You're not borrowing one from Russia. You're getting one from the United States. If you're borrowing one from the United States Navy, and it's going to come with a few codicils, of which a lot of it's going to be, they go to war, a young man or a boy or a girl, and they come back a seasoned man, a warrior with a lot of world travel and experience. And all right, read my books, see what you think. I mean, I'm not opposed. I'm very much of a patriot. I love the United States Marine Corps in this country, and I believe we have to fight for it on occasion. But when you go, I would love to have taught at the basic school after I got back. I know that, the guy who sent me to my last duty station in Camp Pendleton said, there's no chance on earth you're going to be teaching at the basic school. And the reason for that was they were afraid that I would teach and that the guys wouldn't go. Well, what I wanted to teach were the guys going anyway, and so that they could accommodate that definition of leadership that I talked about, which is really a tough one to apply in a combat situation, and also to understand that they are not set there as they were. They are set there to develop into what they can be to those men. And in that unit, that you're not, because you're a lieutenant, doesn't mean jack. I was junior, and I had to grow up among these hardened, bitter young men, and I had to change, and I did. And I like to think that the cause was good, even though, being a Vietnam veteran, combat veteran, certainly does not make you the ultimate war historian, nor an analyst, or any of that. I fought a small war in a small place, mostly known as the A Shau Valley, the Valley of Death, the Valley of No Return. And as the gunny said, when I said, Gunny, you've been to the A Shau before, because he was older and seasoned, he said, well, I went to the A Shau, but I didn't come back. This isn't me. And I came back as someone else. And I said, doesn't seem that way to me. And he said, well, you just got here 7 days ago. What was he like? What are you now? And I had to sit there and really reflect on the fact that I didn't much recognize that kid who got off that air-conditioned airplane in the muck and the mosquitoes and the leeches and the, on the internecine problems of the unit and all of that landing on you, and the noise. And no one told me it was that noisy in combat. It was miserable. I mean, that's loud stuff. You can't hear it. At night, you're night blind from the flashes. So now I'm an officer leading a company and I'm blind and deaf. Well, this is a good combo. How do you manage that? How do you get through when in an implacable enemy? I mean, those were like Marines, those Vietnamese. They were not run down. They were supplied. They were tough. They were mean. They were unforgiving. We didn't take prisoners over there, and neither did they. It was that kind of on your belly in the muck type war. And that's what's in this book and in the other books, the reality of living that. I mean, maybe in Oklahoma you have to know how to get a leech off, but in Vietnam you had to learn those things and other things as well. You do have to learn certain social things, and of course I always push that definition of leadership and try to apply it to this day.
I hope we're able to do this again, maybe in a few months. I understand that there's a loose organized group that have decided that they want to meet Erica this summer. I'm sure we'll report more on that at another date.
But if anybody does have an opportunity to visit jamesstrauss.com,
read the book. But when you realize there's over 6,500 comments, And most of these comments, as you well know, are by veterans of different campaigns. They're not all Vietnam veterans. We have had World War II veterans and Korean veterans talk. You know my wife. We did kind of set this interview up, and I appreciate your time and energy, but I'm looking at, people might be tired of us too. I don't know. I do want to give a shout out to Leland Best. Leland has offered his services in helping us produce this video. Jim, again, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to us spending some more time this year. I want you to go to your lovely wife and Mike and Julie. This has been an honor for me. We had about, a 20-year void there where we didn't follow each other but I'm just so gratified that I've had the opportunity to get back with the James Strauss that I met. Anything else, Jim?
No. I think you did mention something interesting, though. The crazy Kansas thing, the rendezvous that we're going to have, came because of the comments. People decided that we should have a book signing. They said in the middle of the U.S. I found out that's Lebanon, Kansas. Well, there's nothing in Lebanon, so we're going to go to a place nearby, Winfield, and hopefully set up a card table and a keg of beer and have a good time. And that should be coming. That's the 4th of July. So inquire on the website if you're, not doing anything on the 4th. We'll be doing something, and it'll be fun. Anyway, thank you, Chuck. It's such a great pleasure.
And I'd like to say thank you to everybody that has an opportunity to watch this video about a book that took a long time to get written. It's not finished yet, but the first 10 days are out on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. 30 Days has September. First 10 Days by James Strauss. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Chuck.
See you soon.